Ask someone who puts everyone first what they want for dinner, and watch what happens. Not what everyone else would enjoy. Not what would be easiest to make. Not what the kids will eat. What they specifically want. The pause that follows is longer than it should be. And what often comes out isn't an answer. It's a deflection. I don't mind. Whatever you prefer. I'm easy. Not because they're indifferent. Because the question aimed directly at them is one they haven't practiced answering. One that, somewhere along the way, stopped feeling like a question they were supposed to have an opinion about. And most people around them never notice. Because the deflection is so smooth, so quick, so wrapped in apparent flexibility, that it looks like easygoingness. Like low maintenance. Like generosity. It's not exactly. It's disappearance. There's a version of selflessness that comes from a full self choosing to give. A person who knows exactly what they want, who has clear preferences and desires and needs, and who, from that fullness, chooses to prioritize someone else. That's a real thing. That's generosity in the truest sense. But there's another version. The one that looks identical from the outside. The one where the person puts everyone first not because they're overflowing, but because somewhere in the process of growing up, they lost the thread of themselves so completely that everyone else first stopped being a choice and became the only available orientation. Where self comes last not as a decision, but as a default so deeply embedded that it barely registers as a position at all. And that second version is what we're talking about today. Jennifer Campbell at the University of British Columbia has studied what researchers call self-concept clarity, the degree to which a person has a clear, stable, internally consistent sense of who they are. Her research, and the decades of work that followed, showed something counterintuitive. People with low self-concept clarity don't just feel uncertain about themselves. They orient outward. They become highly attuned to the preferences, needs, and emotional states of others, because in the absence of a clear internal map, external signals become the primary source of direction. In other words, when you don't have a strong sense of what you want, you default to managing what everyone else wants. And that looks, from the outside, like putting everyone first. One of the invisible costs of carrying everything for everyone is losing access to your own preferences. What do you want? What do you need? What would you choose if no one else was involved? If those questions take longer to answer, then they should. That's not nothing. That's what years of putting others first actually looks like. I go much deeper into this in what I've linked below. Description and first pinned comment. The question is where the clarity went. Because it wasn't always absent. John Bowlby's work on attachment describes a pattern that emerges reliably when a child's needs are consistently treated as secondary. To a parent's emotional state, to the needs of a sibling, to the general climate of a household that simply didn't have the capacity to hold them. The child who learns, through repetition, that the emotional weather of the room depends more on others' needs than on their own, begins to orient accordingly. They become readers of rooms. Monitors of moods. People who know, before the question is even asked, what each person around them needs, and who have lost, in the process of developing that sensitivity, the habit of turning that same attention inward. Because inward was never where the important information seemed to live. The world confirmed this. The child who anticipated needs was praised. The one who expressed their own was managed. The one who gave first was called thoughtful, generous, mature. The one who asked was called demanding, difficult, too much. And so they chose, or the environment chose for them, to become the first kind. And something quietly left with that choice. Edward Deci and Richard Ryan, whose self-determination theory has generated decades of research, identified autonomy as one of 3 fundamental psychological needs, the others being competence and relatedness. Autonomy, in this framework, doesn't mean independence. It means acting in alignment with your own values and preferences. Having a sense that the choices you make reflect something real about who you are. When autonomy is chronically suppressed, when the habit of choosing yourself is never formed, or is formed and then consistently overridden, the research shows predictable consequences. Not just dissatisfaction. A deeper kind of disconnection from the self. A growing difficulty identifying what one actually prefers, feels, or wants, because those signals have been systematically deprioritized for so long they've become hard to read. The person who puts everyone first doesn't just lose time and energy to others' needs. They lose the thread back to themselves. And there's something else, something you feel but can't always explain, that shows up alongside this loss. Resentment. Quiet, difficult to justify, socially dangerous to express. Because they chose this, didn't they? No one forced them to say yes. No one made them put themselves last. And yet, underneath the accommodation, underneath the careful attention to everyone else's comfort, something accumulates. Not anger exactly. More like the weight of a life lived mostly in service of other people's stories, while your own one waits, indefinitely, for a turn that never quite arrives. And the people who benefit most from this arrangement rarely notice it. Not because they're selfish. Because the person putting everyone first has made it invisible. Has absorbed the cost so quietly, so consistently, that there's nothing in the dynamic that signals anything is wrong. But here's what almost no one says about the person who puts everyone first. You cannot genuinely give from a self you never built. What looks like selflessness, from the outside, from the people who rely on it, is often a person in the ongoing process of erasing themselves. And the world, which benefits enormously from that erasure, has very little incentive to name it. It's easier to call you generous, call you selfless, to accept the gift and not ask what it cost. The selfless person and the self-erasing person look identical until something forces the question. An illness, loss, a moment of crisis where the structures collapse and no one is left to manage, and the person finds themselves suddenly without the thing they've always used to navigate, someone else's need to organize themselves around. And in that silence, they find they barely know where to start. And that silence is one of the most disorienting experiences available to someone in this pattern. Because the absence of a need to organize around doesn't produce freedom. Produces a kind of vertigo. A loss of orientation that feels surprisingly similar to loneliness, even in moments where the person is surrounded by people who love them. Because the structure that was giving their days coherence, the forward motion of attending to others, has temporarily disappeared. And what's left is a self they've never fully gotten to know. This is the cost that most people on the outside of this pattern never see coming. They assume the person who always puts others first is running on genuine surplus. That there's a fullness underneath all the giving. That the generosity comes from somewhere reliable. But it often doesn't. It often comes from the fact that being needed was, for a very long time, the only way to have a place in the room. And giving, for someone raised in that dynamic, is not rest from the self, it is the self. The one stable thing in an interior that has been organized around external needs for so long that its own contents have become unfamiliar. Learning to sit in that unfamiliar space, without immediately reaching for something to fix, someone to attend to, a function to fulfill, is not comfortable. It's some of the hardest work a person in this pattern will ever do. But it's also the only way to find out who they are when no one needs anything. And that discovery, when it finally happens, tends to arrive in a particular form. Not dramatically, not as a sudden revelation, but as a quiet noticing, in the space of an ordinary day where nothing is being required of them, that there is something underneath the role that has been waiting very patiently for the role to pause. Preference that has no function. An interest that serves no one. A feeling that belongs specifically to them, that isn't shaped by what anyone else is feeling, that is genuinely and specifically theirs. Jennifer Campbell's research on self-concept clarity points to something specific about this moment. It can feel destabilizing before it feels like freedom. Because a person who has organized around others for long enough has developed their sense of coherence from that orientation. What makes them feel real, what makes the world feel navigable, is knowing what others need and providing it. The turn inward, in the absence of that orienting function, can initially feel like vertigo rather than discovery. Which is why most people in this pattern don't drift toward self-knowledge naturally. They're pulled there, usually by some disruption in the external system, an illness, a loss, a relationship that changes, a season where the demands temporarily lift, that removes the function and leaves them, briefly, without the scaffolding they've been using in place of a self. And in that space, something becomes possible that wasn't before. The question, not what does everyone need, but what do I actually want? That question, asked honestly for the first time, is the beginning of a different kind of life. Pay attention to who reaches out to you. When nothing is wrong. When you have nothing to offer. When you're not in the middle of a crisis. When you're just existing. Those people are different from the ones who show up only when they need something. That difference matters more than most people realize. I go much deeper into it in what I've linked below. Description and first pinned comment. Now I want to ask you something directly. What do you want? Not what would be least disruptive. Not what would make everyone else comfortable. Not what seems reasonable given what everyone around you needs. What do you specifically in your life in this season actually want? If that question requires more time than it should. If your first instinct was to reframe it around what others might want, or to produce an answer that feels safe and undemanding. If the honest answer feels somehow presumptuous to even think, let alone say out loud, I want you to notice that. Because that moment, the moment the question turns toward you and something goes quiet, is where the pattern lives. And then this one, think about the people in your life who you put first. Who call when they need something. Who you organize yourself around, whose moods you monitor, whose needs you anticipate before they've been expressed. Now think about who, in that same group, reaches out to you when nothing is wrong. Not because they need something. Not because you've been helpful recently. But simply because they wanted to know how you were. The size of that second group tells you something important. Not about whether people love you. About what kind of relationship you've made possible. And what kind you haven't. Putting everyone first isn't a flaw. It formed for reasons, in a context that required it, and it contains something real. The attentiveness, the care, the ability to read what others need. These are genuine capacities. They didn't come from nowhere. But they deserve to be a choice. Not a compulsion. Not a default. Not the only mode available. And somewhere in all the years of others coming first, you have been waiting without quite realizing it. For a turn. For the question to land on you and stay there. This is that turn. What do you want? If something in this video found you today, leave a comment. Tell me one thing you've wanted for a long time that you've kept moving to the back of the line. I read everything. And subscribe if you haven't, because next week we go into what happens when this pattern meets relationships. The specific dynamic that forms when someone who always puts others first finally meets someone who lets them. That one changes everything.